Mandatory across-the-board federal budget cuts are going into effect after Congress and the president failed to reach a budget deal. President Obama and congressional leaders met for about 45 minutes on Friday, but were unable to agree on a resolution to the impasse over cutting $85 billion from the federal budget under sequestration. Both sides agree there are smarter ways to cut government spending, but they could not prevent the sequester from going into effect at midnight on Friday. I spoke with Oklahoma 4th District Congressman Tom Cole by phone about the breakdown in negotiations and what the cuts will do. Congressman Cole, Congress reached a deal on January 1st to avert going over the fiscal cliff. What's the difference this time?
Well, I think there's just simply no understanding on the White House in the way there was, frankly, amongst Republicans on January 1st that these things are written into law. They're going to happen, and what you need to do is adjust to them. You know, in the case of the fiscal cliff deal, there were more than enough Republicans, honestly, to forge a compromise, and the president got revenues, got no spending cuts, but got revenue. In this case, the spending cuts are written into law. The Republicans have said we're more than willing to renegotiate where they come from, and we can do this in a much less painful manner, but we're not going to change our mind over whether or not the cuts take place. And in that sense, they're very similar to the position the president took on the fiscal cliff. He said, I can renegotiate where the revenue comes from, but I am going to get revenue. So I'm frankly a little bit puzzled that the president didn't realize that the roles would be reversed this time, and that the smart thing to do was negotiate ahead of time.
The 6-month budget continuing resolution that funds the federal government will expire on March 27th. Will that deadline force a resolution of this budget impasse? I
think it'll move us in the right direction. I think the odds are that a larger deal will come this summer, which I'm frankly more hopeful about. But I think the first thing to do in terms of the continuing resolution, which would end all government spending, is to try and pass something early so we don't have a crisis. And I think that's exactly what the Republicans intend to do next week. And they're working with Democrats in the Senate to try and find common ground. We'll probably pass something, try to make some adjustments for military spending and veterans and military construction to provide flexibility. I think Democrats are interested in some flexibility on other areas, which I think we would probably try to accommodate. And again, let's try to avoid this last-minute scenario at the end of the month, and buy each side enough time to continue negotiating a much larger package. To me, that would probably come around a debt ceiling vote sometime between the middle of May and, let's say, about the 1st of August, where you could put together entitlement reform, debt ceiling increase, maybe tax code reform, because I think that's absolutely key, and then spending restraint, and that might finally get you that elusive grand bargain that both sides have been looking to achieve.
So do you think that grand bargain is still possible?
I do. I actually think the elements are there. There have actually been a series of compromises so far. They just haven't been big enough. There was a compromise on the budget in April of 2011 where the Republicans cut spending but not as much as they wanted. There was a compromise on the debt ceiling, which had both a reduction in long-term spending and or potentially revenue. There was a compromise on the fiscal cliff. I think sooner or later there'll be a compromise here on the sequester. But again, we're waiting too often to the last minute and doing it in a crisis situation. So I hope this is the last one of those. We can catch our breath and sit down and try to find some middle ground between the two sides.
Under sequestration, entitlements are not cut, but defense is. What do you think these cuts will do to the military, especially in the short term?
Oh, it's very bad. There's no question about it. Look, now they're not catastrophic, but they're severe. We're talking on an annual basis defense cuts in the 8 or 9% range, and you have to remember, it's not as if the world is suddenly a safe place. This is not the post-Cold War era with the collapse of the old Soviet Union. We still have 60,000 American troops in combat in Afghanistan. We still have a dangerous terrorist adversary that is interested in doing us harm, and we have other potential rival powers like China that are actually building up their military. So this is actually not the time to reduce the military, which has already been cut over the next 10 years by almost $500 billion. This would be an additional $500 billion, roughly. So that's just way too much to absorb. And again, I think cooler heads will prevail here, and will redistribute the cuts. Remember, this is $85 billion in a $3.5 trillion budget, so it's only 2.4% of the entire federal budget. We could handle that if we were willing to look at entitlements and willing to look in other areas in the budget. Republicans have done that twice in the House in December and May of last year. So far, the Senate hasn't passed a bill, and quite honestly, the president hasn't even. He's laid out some general principles, but he hasn't put forward a specific plan as to what he would do.
Other than defense, where do you think people will feel the cuts?
I think you'll feel them in Oklahoma in Indian health care. We have quite a substantial Native American population. You'll certainly see them there. I think you could certainly see them, specifically again in Oklahoma at the FAA Center, Federal Aeronautical Center, where we train most of our traffic controllers and do some really important work. You can see them at places like the Severe Storm Laboratory Severe Storm Center in Norman, and also Kerr Labs and places like Ada. We have a lot of federal facilities in Oklahoma. Again, you start looking at places like Altus Air Force Base and Vance Air Force Base. They have very substantial civilian workforces. So, it's gonna be widespread and visible. It'll be slow, and nobody should be furloughed in a month. That actually gives Congress more time to deal with it. But again, we need to get a process of discussion and negotiation started. That hasn't happened in the last 6 weeks. I mean, today's the first day that the president's actually talked with and brought down the leaders of the legislature, and we've known this was coming for 18 months. I mean, so I think the president, honestly, in my view, tried to achieve this by winning a public relations campaign style victory. That's not going to work in the context of what's going to have to be a legislative negotiation.
Congressman Tom Cole, as always, thanks for visiting with us.
Thank you very much, Dick.